Today we're going to be tying the twisted bugger. We're going to start off by wrapping our wire up the shank of the hook. We want about half the shank covered with wire. You can either helicopter the tag end of the wire off or use a dull pair of scissors. Then push it up against the cone head tight, and this will lock the cone in place. You can continue making wraps down the shank until you reach the halfway mark, and then proceed to helicopter that tag end off. Now we're going to make like a little thread dam right behind the wire to keep it from slipping. And then we're going to proceed to cover the wire with thread wraps. This will just make it easier working around the wire as we go. Now we're going to take our brown marabou and pull the fibers off the stem. We're going to measure out the length of the shank and then kick it back, making one loose wrap and then pulling it tight, followed by a second wrap. After making a couple wraps to hold it in place, cut the tag end so it will land just behind the wire. Then advance your thread behind the wire and then bring it back down to your tie-in point. Now you can strip away a clump of yellow marabou from the stem, just like we did with the brown. Now take your small clump of yellow marabou and tie it in, making sure the tail is the same length as the brown. Make this clump a third of the size of the brown. It's going to act as a divider between the brown marabou and the orange marabou. Now advance your thread up to just behind the wire like before, and then trim off the excess marabou. The reason we keep cutting the marabou right before the wire is this helps stop from creating a lump in the middle of the fly where the marabou would overlap the wire. Now take your orange marabou and separate it away from the stem yet again, making this clump a little bit bigger than the brown one. If you have to separate multiple pieces of marabou from its stem to help build up a bigger clump, take your time and make sure it's the size you want it to be. Now make sure the tail lines up with all the other sections of marabou. Make one loose wrap before pulling it tight. Again, we're going to trim off the marabou right where it meets the wire. Now tie in your copper wire. Now we're going to start making our dubbing noodle. By pinching down tightly with your thumb and pointer finger and twisting on the dubbing. With synthetic materials like this, it's a little bit harder to make dubbing noodles. They make a wax to aid in this, but I prefer to use either saliva or water. It makes it so that it doesn't bind up all the fibers. Using spit and saliva, it makes it so it's more buggier and easier to brush out in the end. Now you can start making connecting wraps up the shank. If your dubbing noodle doesn't make it all the way to the cone, just apply more to the thread and continue wrapping until you reach the cone. You're going to take a piece of schlappen and clear the wispy fibers near the bottom of the stem off, and then trim it up short. Then cram the stem in behind the cone and tie it in nice and tight. Now you can take your hackle pliers and attach them to the tip. Now you're going to start making evenly spaced wraps over the dubbing until you reach where your marabou is tied in. First, you'll make a couple wraps up behind the cone to create a collar. Then you'll start working your way down. Once you've made it to where both the wire and marabou are tied in, you're going to take your copper wire you tied in earlier and use it to catch that tip of the schlappen. Not only will this lock it in place, but by using the wire, it will add durability to the fly. Wiggle the copper wire while you work it back up the shank behind the cone. Now tie in the copper wire, using moderate tension, trying to pull it slightly in to the cone. Once you have it tied in, use a pair of junk scissors, whether they're dull or some you picked up at the dollar store, and cut the wire. Now push that cut section of the wire back under the cone. This will keep you from fraying your thread while you continue to tie. Depending on how long of the tip of schlappen is hanging out of the fly, you can choose to trim it or leave it. After running your fingers through and loosening up all the feathers, we're going to make some thread wraps to build like a little valley behind the cone, where after we make our dubbing loop, we're going to wrap around. It just makes it a little bit easier for the next steps. There's a couple different ways you can go about making the collar of this fly. I like to make a dubbing loop, and to prepare for that I will mix the angel hair and brown tan dubbing together by twisting and pulling them apart in a clump. Then I'll lay out the mixed up dub and angel hair and prep for my dubbing loop. I'll start working my thread back over the loop and then loop it around the loop a few times to help lock it into place. Then I'll make thread wraps over the loop, advancing back towards the bend of the hook, just to make sure it doesn't slip out. Then I will use my fingers to spread the loop open, starting with 1 or 2. Then I'll start feeding my dubbing angel hair mix into place by sliding it up as close to the hook shank as possible. I'll repeat this process until the whole loop is full. Once the loop is full, I'll start to spin it. Run your dubbing brush over the loop real quickly. Then start making connecting wraps. In between each one, you can use your fingertips to push your dubbing brush back. That way you don't capture your fibers with each wrap, and it's easier to brush out in the end. Continue making wraps until you're as tight behind the cone as possible. Now tie in your brush. Trim the tag end. Make a few more wraps to lock everything down. Now throw in a whip finish. Give the fly a final brush and you're good to go.